Hi, I'm Swanee Hunt and delighted that you can be with us. You know, you are going to have a rare occasion today. I had that rare occasion many times when I was in 93. I became ambassador to Vienna. And one of the people who was storied in terms of her role in the Clinton administration was Elaine Kamarck. And she and I were exactly the same age, like almost to the month. And so we had this great affinity, and I kept hearing about reinventing government as being one of Vice President Gore's big initiatives. And lo and behold, I found out that it was our Elaine Kamarck who was in charge of the whole thing. And I was blown off, my feet. So when we got to know each other so well living here in DC, this was a great opportunity for me to really try to get inside of the vice president's office. I was, in the presence of a woman whom I had met again up at the Kennedy School of Government, where I think we came at the same time. Elaine, is that what you think?
Yeah. We did.
Yeah. And so we were these two upstarts from our roles at the Clinton administration. And so she and I would get together and we would say how wonderful the place was and how horrible the place was and what was going on in our lives. And it was this like girlfriend experience, right? And lo and behold, come to find out that she's written like 6 books, and I kept coming across her name, whether I opened up the Washington Post or the New York Times or endless articles that she has published. So I was delighted when I heard about this book coming up. It's an e-book and it's on Brookings Press. So for sure, download it. Elaine, I think it's 35 pages. Have you
very
counted?
Sure.
Okay. And it's picking the vice president. And I can't think of another election where picking the vice president is such a big deal as right now, for all the reasons we know, with the Women's March and Black Lives Matter and et cetera, and so forth. So I'm going to be moderating this in a way, but basically I'm going to stop talking and turn this over to Elaine. And then my picture is going to disappear unless I start talking. Elaine, I'm going to try so hard not to talk too much, but I can't promise anything. I will tell you that in the past, there have been maybe half a dozen times that either in our home in Cambridge or here in DC, you have been the main guest. And by guest, I mean that we have milked you for all of your policy wonk ideas. And every time you came and spoke in our home, my stock went up, so I'm trusting the same things happening here in DC for all the people who are coming into my sphere via you. So Elaine, may I turn this over to you? And then when I do talk, then the picture is going to go over to me and then it'll come back to you. And I'm encouraging everyone to write your questions or thoughts, on the chat board. And if you don't know how to use the chat board, I don't know if I can help you. You go to the bottom of the screen, and it should ask you if you want the chat board. And so type away, and then I will be reading the chat board, and I'll send a few questions over to Elaine, and we are going to tie this up in an hour. Does that work?
That works.
Okay.
Thank you, Swanee, my good friend. I'm so happy you're in Washington, down the street from me, even though we're still doing this via Zoom, and we will be for quite some time. So thank you, everyone, for joining me. I went to work for Al Gore in 1993, and I had been following politics closely before that. In 1992, during the election, once Clinton was the nominee, everybody assumed that Mario Cuomo was going to be the vice presidential pick. And they assumed that because everyone's model for the vice president was balance. So you had a Southern New Democrat. So, of course, you had to have a Northern liberal to balance him out. Bill Clinton made a very unusual and it turns out revolutionary choice. He picked somebody who was just like him. He picked another Southerner, baby boomer, member of the Democratic Leadership Council, so sort of in the middle of the Democratic Party, not on the far left of the party, and this surprised everybody. In Clinton's autobiography, he says, "I wanted to reinforce my message, not to confuse my message."
Mm.
And there began a series of very different vice presidencies. So the book begins with a discussion of what I call the balance model. The reason that for most of American history, the person put on the ticket was somebody to balance the presidential candidate was because for most of American history, presidential candidates were chosen in conventions. Now, especially in the old days, the delegates would come into these conventions and nobody knew who they were for. You often had to have a first ballot just to figure out what the room was doing, right? And who was there for who. There was certainly no Twitter, there was no email, there was no television, no radio for much of this time. It was very difficult to figure out who was for who. And often you would come into these conventions with 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 candidates, all splitting up the delegate votes. And then would begin a series of complicated negotiations. We think of them today as the smoke-filled room. And sure enough, I suspect there were a lot of cigars. It was mostly men. Ironically, for some of history, it wasn't mostly white men because there were black big city machines. So you had the leaders of those machines in there, but it was definitely all men. I mean, that's for sure. And they would have to go through a series of negotiations before they would finally settle on somebody who could get a majority of the delegates voting for them. In the course of these negotiations, the biggest plum to dangle was, of course, the vice presidency, right? That was the biggest thing you could give away. And that's why, for much of American history, the vice president was a balancer. It was always he was chosen from the opposite wing of the party or from the opposite geography of the party. Many years, you had a northerner and a southerner all the time. That was always the match, okay, and particularly in the Democratic Party, and so that's how business was done. And the vice president, when the vice presidency was chosen in the balance model, um, interesting things happened. For instance, most of the time, these two guys didn't like each other. Not only did they not like each other, sometimes they actually hated each other. There are some vice presidents I talk about in the book, and it's quite funny to think of it now, but there were some vice presidents who spent their time in office in the Senate actively opposing the legislation of the president they served. Okay. And now you can't even imagine such a thing today. Franklin Roosevelt's first vice president, used to literally sit in the Senate and he didn't want to get quoted on anything, but he would give a thumbs up or a thumbs down on legislation. And he was against a lot of the New Deal legislation, etc. Obviously, he didn't remain Roosevelt's vice president for too long. But basically, this sort of what I call in the book a dysfunctional marriage uh, came out of the fact that, frankly, these were arranged marriages, right? There were no love matches. These were simply arranged marriages. Sometimes they worked. I mean, Jimmy Carter and Walter Mondale had a very good relationship, but that was just because, frankly, the two of them are extremely decent men. But that was an arranged marriage. I mean, Jimmy Carter was sort of a Southern conservative. Walter Mondale was a Northern, old-fashioned New Deal liberal. So that was the match. There was no reason other than their own personalities. that made that work. So that's most of the history of the vice presidency. Not surprisingly, also, the vice presidency became a very insignificant office. Because let's face it, if you're the president, you've been forced to pick somebody who's from a different region and a different philosophy of the party. Well, you're not going to trust them to do anything, right? You can't really delegate to your vice president any big jobs because you don't that he, you know that you don't agree with him and he doesn't agree with you. So the vice presidency became it's like an understudy, but the understudy isn't allowed to read the script. Okay, vice presidents weren't read into anything important, and it didn't matter whether or not the vice president was a person of substance or not. I mean, Lyndon Johnson was an incredibly effective leader in the Senate, and a very powerful politician, very knowledgeable. And Jack Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy just didn't like him one darn bit and never told him anything. Okay, and he was pushed to the side. And of course, the most famous story is Harry Truman, who was again, a powerful senator, had a huge role in our war materiel in World War II. When he eventually became Roosevelt's vice president and Roosevelt died, Harry Truman had not even been told about the atom bombs being developed in Los Alamos. Okay, biggest secret of the administration, Harry Truman didn't know about it until he became president. So these guys were really out of the loop, so to speak. I opened the book with a scene from one of my most favorite TV shows, Veep, where Julia Dreyfus plays a very forlorn vice president with a lot of trouble. And one of my favorite scenes is she keeps walking into her office and saying to her receptionist, "Has the president called?" And the receptionist just doesn't even look up from her computer. She just says, "Nope." And that repeats itself all the way throughout. Presidents did not call vice presidents for most of American history. Then you come to the change in the way we nominated presidents. Suddenly, presidents are selected really in primaries. The delegates go to the convention, and by and large, delegates simply voted the way their state voted in the primaries. The outcome is known before you get to the convention. Usually the candidate goes in with the magic number of delegates. There's no need for this intense negotiation. And the model changes. And in the book, I write about the model changing from a balancing model to a partnership model, or from an arranged marriage to a love match, where they pick somebody increasingly who is like them. And if you pick a partner, guess what? You can delegate a lot of things to your partner. You can make your life a lot easier. They think like you, they just know what you want, etc. So if we look at the 4 vice presidents since Al Gore, well, including Al Gore, Dick Cheney, Joe Biden, and Mike Pence, they're very different vice presidents than most of American history. None of them are balancers. Okay, I mean, Joe Biden came from Delaware, 3 electoral votes, and a solidly Democratic state. Obama did not need Joe Biden for that political purpose. Look at Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney came from Texas and Wyoming. The only reason he changed his registration to Wyoming is the Constitution says you can't have the 2 offices from the same state. But basically, he was a Texas oil guy, just like Bush. Okay, there's just no difference between them. So the model moves to a partnership model. And sure enough, and this is what I do in the end of the book, sure enough, between Gore, Cheney, Biden, and Mike Pence, you have vice presidents who are very much, first of all, in the middle of things, in the middle of the action, and secondly, who have responsibilities given to them by their president, which are non-trivial responsibilities. Hubert Humphrey, Lyndon Johnson's vice president, very distinguished senator, very experienced lawmaker, was allowed to chair a commission on scenic beauty and tourism in the United States. Not exactly a front burner issue, okay? Now I'd like to have that job, but I mean, for somebody at the height of their power, this was just not a big deal. So anyway, that's the change in the model, and it's a significant change. My prediction is it will not go backwards. That the public now expects to see vice presidents who are substantive and capable of being president. This becomes more important if the presidential candidate is old, which is the situation now with both our incumbent president and with his challenger, Joe Biden. It's more important than ever. And I think we saw the change reflected in the electorate with the decision by John McCain to pick Sarah Palin. Initially, Sarah Palin looked like a brilliant pick because she was so charismatic. She was a really great performer. She was a great political performer. As time went on, though, it turned out she just didn't know very much. And she really was not ready to be president of the United States. She had doubts. She didn't quite know what the Federal Reserve Board was and all sorts of things we expect. And the public judged her harshly for that. And I think that's because they grew accustomed to seeing a different kind of vice president. I write in the book, and I give some examples, that I think Al Gore and Dick Cheney between them probably had more power between them and wielded more influence than probably all the vice presidents that had gone before them. That's how big the change was. So with that, why don't I stop? I see there are some questions in this.
That's
okay.
Right. And first of all, from Rosabeth Moss-Cantor, you've been in my room before speaking as well about your many books. And Elaine, I'm so glad you have Rosabeth here, and she will probably she'll probably ask you. She'll ask you some tough questions, I'm sure. And then Chris Gabrielli asking everyone, didn't Biden, Cheney, Pence provide balance on message for the candidates?
No, not really. I mean, they were certainly not geographic balancers, and neither were they really ideological balancers. Biden was, they made a big deal about him being able to talk to white working class people, but I think that was more of them grafting the old model onto what was fundamentally a new pick. Cheney was very, very much on the Bush bandwagon. There's no difference between Cheney and Bush, and there's no difference between Pence and Trump. Although the Pence one is a little hard to figure, not really because of Pence, but because Trump himself had no clear ideological background. I mean, he was a Democrat, he was pro-choice, he became a Republican, he was, he changed his mind on abortion and on a bunch of other issues. So it's a little bit hard to make that analogy. But I think that both Biden and Cheney saw their roles as vice president to reinforce the message of the presidential candidate, as opposed to doing anything different from that.
Mm-hmm. And so when you think, this is great. This is from, she's writing to all the panelists, Shireen, and she says, you're reminding me of a hilarious Saturday Night Live skit in 2000, which is a spoof on The Bachelor, in which Al Gore offers a rise to Lieberman. Oh, yes.
I think she means a rose.
A raise. What'd you say? A rose?
I think she means a rose. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Do you remember the scene?
I do indeed. And one of the things that's really very funny about that is and I use it in the book. I use the analogy of love matches and arranged marriages. Joe Lieberman really wanted, I'm sorry, John McCain really wanted to pick Joe Lieberman to
Uh-huh.
vice presidential candidate, and he got talked out of this, and it was a real problem. But when he ended up with Palin, but I think that one of the things about Gore's choice of Lieberman was that once again it was not a balancing choice. Connecticut is a solidly Democratic state, not a particularly big state, but Gore chose Lieberman over John Edwards, who many of his political advisors were pushing because they thought that Gore needed somebody sexier and younger, etc. And I have this in the book, but at one point Gore looked at me and said, "Can you imagine him being president?" referring to John Edwards. So in Gore's mind, and this is one of the things I think we have to realize in this period of time, the candidates who have been vice president in this new model, in the partnership model, where they have taken on significant assignments from the president, where they've and I have a couple examples of those in the book, where they've wielded considerable power. I give examples in the book of the ways in which Cheney basically ran the show, particularly in Bush's first term. The ways, situations where people try to do end runs around Al Gore to the president, always to be told, well, no, ask Al. Okay, so these vice presidents have wielded significant power, and they wielded power because their presidents trusted them. They were similar to them. And I would guess that as Joe Biden is making his decision this week and next week, that Joe Biden is saying, okay, I know what kind of vice president I was. Will this person be the same kind of vice president? And that's how the model, I think, has been reinforced. Interestingly enough, though, the old model lives. I mean, I just was watching CNN 10 minutes ago, 15 minutes ago, and sure enough, they were talking about states, right? States are really irrelevant. There is no evidence that the vice presidential candidate carries a state for the ticket. There's even evidence going back to Jack Kennedy and LBJ that LBJ didn't carry Texas for Jack Kennedy, that he didn't need that. So I think there's the old model lives on in the minds of commentators, when there's a pretty fair amount of evidence that no, that's not how presidential candidates think about this.
You know, Elaine, to an earlier point that you were making, I remember during the campaign in '92, I was talking to Al Gore, not yet vice president, and we were talking about something about someone else, you know, to be in the administration. And his comment to me was, well, that's above my pay grade. Which I think
Yeah,
is
right,
so apropos what you're saying here.
right.
And then I wanted to ask you something. Oh, hi, there's Jenny, Jenny Mansbridge. Okay,
Oh,
so,
Jen, hi.
oh, I have to let Jenny go first. Okay, listen, obvious question, I'll ask it. Who would you predict will be Biden's choice for VP? And wouldn't a black woman be a kind of balancer within the current Democratic Party?
Yes, I think that well, let's even go back further. Before Joe Biden had even won the nomination, he had pledged to make a woman a vice president. He'd pledged to pick a woman, and then I think with the George Floyd, killings and all the protests after that, that narrowed even more that he would be picking a black woman, and I think that's what he'll do. Um, One of the things that has happened that a lot of male analysts, frankly, keep missing is that the Democratic Party has become the women's party. There is
Mhm.
a massive gender gap. We've never seen a gender gap like this. It exists not just in polls, but it existed in the 2017 off-year elections, in the 2018 midterm elections, and then the elections that happened in 2019. You know, there were a handful of them. Same pattern right across the board. Women have moved into the Democratic Party in massive numbers. And we had three very qualified women and then some other women that I wouldn't put in that category, running for president in 2020, running in the Democratic primary. So this has become a woman's party. So it wasn't, so I think that there was a sort of a historical imperative here to go back to a kind of balance by going back to going back to a different day and making sure there was a woman on the ticket. And I think that's right. But then when you start narrowing down that field, right, what's pretty clear is that that Biden is looking for somebody who has the relevant experience to help him in the job. So therefore, there's lots of talented women out there, but you know, the wonderful mayor of Atlanta, she's got a great political future. There's no doubt about it. But you know what? She's not ready to step into the Oval Office should something happen to Biden. And there's a lot of other women who I think fell by the wayside because the partnership model is still very much alive and well. So you're going to see it within this broad balancing model of gender. I think you are going to see the partnership model there. And then there's a final hard to define quality, impossible for us from the outside to define, which is what's the chemistry between the two individuals.
Yeah.
This is very much like a marriage. You do have to talk about chemistry. They do have to like each other. Joe Biden was put on the ticket really in order to help Barack Obama through the big mess of the Middle East and Iraq and Iran and all that, and Afghanistan and all that stuff. And at least the initial histories indicate that while they started out different generations, you know, different experiences, etc., they really grew to like each other. There's actually a book that talks about their bromance between the two of them. So, and certainly for those of us in the White House, you may remember this, Swanee, at least in the first term, Gore and Clinton were just delighted to be in each other's company. They had fun with each other. They liked each other enormously. And then if we go back to the marital analogy, what broke that up? Well, an affair. Okay, this time the affair with Monica Lewinsky. So, you know, I think that there's that indefinable, you know, chemistry that we just can't predict from the outside.
Yeah, and the word, at least as far back as I was from the White House, was that chemistry was so strong that Gore said, you know, I don't want to be in this position of VP unless you give me something that's worth my time. And that's when the whole reinventing government, among other things, became his. Maybe he just, I don't know. You're the person who was there. I'm the edge of the rumor mill.
Well, I mean, there's two things to say about that. First of all, there were three sort of new initiatives that Clinton had campaigned on: welfare reform, reinventing government, and healthcare. Healthcare Hillary took. Okay, so one of the things that I just glance at in this short book, but if I ever write a longer book, I'll talk about more, is the other thing about modern White Houses is you suddenly have women who have, like Hillary Clinton, professional backgrounds and their own intense interest in policy and politics. So Al Gore found himself in a White House with two vice presidents, right? The First Lady and him. And they had their battles. They battled it out to see who was going to do what. And Hillary got first dibs on healthcare. So that was the first thing. Then because Hillary got first dibs on healthcare, Donna Shalala, who was head of HHS, right? If you had taken welfare away from her, that was going to be very bad and unpolitics. So Gore didn't get that. So he sort of ended up with reinventing government. But the other thing he did that he had little competition for is he really played a central role in foreign policy. And he made some big institutional changes that I talk about in the book, like putting his own staffer on the Deputies Committee, which is the sort of integral foreign policy day-to-day operations committee. He was very much in the middle of every foreign policy issue, and Clinton relied heavily on him. And in some areas, like the Gore Cheerleading Commission, Gore was in charge of developing a relationship with Victor Cheerleading, who was the vice premier of Russia at the time. So he had these huge areas of responsibility that were simply his own.
And Elaine, I'm aware that there may be people in the audience who don't know the ins and outs of reinventing government. Can you give us a paragraph or two about what that meant? Because I think it'll also help us see how the difficulties and the opportunities of a vice president. And of course, you were running the thing.
Yeah. So reinventing government was really a campaign concept that Clinton came up with in the campaign based on David Osborne's best-selling book called Reinventing Government. And, you know, and Clinton talked about it. It was a very handy way for Clinton to talk about it because it was signaling something very important to swing voters, which is, yes, I'm a Democrat. Yes, I believe in an activist government, but I'm not a crazy Democrat who wants to spend all your tax dollars on all sorts of stuff, right? And so it was a very effective way to signal that while he was a Democrat, you could trust him to be careful with your tax dollars. And that was exactly the right message at that point in time for the electorate. Frankly, probably is still, but that's another story. Okay. So then Gore had to figure out what exactly did that mean. And we were able to get a sufficient number of resources. We built a big staff. We had a whole office building floor across the street from the White House. We were able to get the resources to conduct the first comprehensive operations and management review of the government that had been done since the 1930s.
Wow.
And this was why this was a big deal. And we differed from sort of smaller efforts that had taken place in the Reagan administration in that we didn't bring in a bunch of outsiders. We relied almost exclusively on experienced civil servants. My management team had they had almost 100 years of experience managing big operations in the federal government. So they kind of knew, you know, what really made the thing work. And we continued this continued for basically 7 years of the administration. I left after the first term. Morley Winograd succeeded me into the second term. And Gore really worked at it, and we just did loads and loads of stuff. So when I'm asked about it now, it doesn't sound like such a big deal because things that are now standard operating procedure, like everybody files their taxes online, okay? They were brand new back then, okay? And so a lot of things that we innovated then are now standard operating procedure for the federal government and frankly for state governments as well.
Well, can I tell you that when I was representing the United States, by the way, I was told before I went, you're not representing the United States, you are the United States of America. So I would talk about our country, and reinventing government was one of the initiatives that I would talk about. It was very, very proud of what you were doing.
Good.
Let's see. This is from Alice Wolf. For the VP pick now, what's the most important experience, back to your earlier statement, for the candidate to be selected?
Well, a little bit of this depends on the presidential candidate. And let me start to answer this with a little story. In 1988, George Bush chose Dan Quayle to be his running mate. Dan Quayle was regarded as a lightweight. He probably was better than his image in history, but he was immediately kind of discounted. He was made fun of. He had a very boyish look and affect to him. And he was simply not looked at as serious. On the other hand, George Bush went ahead and won that race. And part of it was that George Bush was 63 years old and quite healthy. So nobody really thought that anything was going to happen to the president. So even though he had made what most people thought was a bad choice for his VP, it didn't really have consequences. And as I said before, the opposite was true of McCain. So looking at Biden, first of all, we know two things about him. First of all, he's extraordinarily experienced in foreign policy, has lots and lots. I mean, I think Joe Biden has probably forgotten more about government and policy than Donald Trump ever knew. Okay, that's just how experienced he is. But secondly, he's 77 years old. Okay, and so there is a not inconsequential probability that he would not serve even his first term. And that being said, the thing that is most unique to the presidency is foreign policy. It is not domestic policy. Okay. Presidents may try to become the education president. They may give a lot of speeches about it. The fact of the matter is, federal funding is 8% of education funding in America. And all the hard decisions, the big decisions, like the ones they're having to make now about reopening schools, they're all local school boards. Okay, it's just not a presidential thing. Therefore, frankly, the foreign policy side of it, some familiarity with understanding intelligence briefings, with understanding the intelligence community, some familiarity with foreign policy, with military operations, I think is probably the most important thing. And that's why I think a lot of people who have only had state experience you see their names are sort of dropping off the list right now because of that. It's funny because, people run for president as if they were running to run your local school board. And then that's not at all what the job is. Not at all.
Right. It brings someone else. Oh, Shireen is apologizing for the earlier typo about rise instead of rose. That's okay, Shireen. We're going to forgive you. Okay, I have a question for you. And when you were talking about the competence of the VP, et cetera, this is like 10 minutes ago. I was thinking about Sarah Palin and the number of times, because I am an ardent feminist like you, may I say, and many of the people who are writing in. And I was thinking how many said to me, well, it's not about having a woman, it's about having the right woman. And I said, well, actually, I don't think that's true. And I don't remember anyone agreeing with me, but I said there are two things. Yeah, you want to have someone whose policies you approve of and whose competence. We've got to break a barrier also. And at least if Sarah Palin becomes vice president, it won't be so unthinkable. And when Hillary lost this last election, it's hard for me to say that she lost it, but that's another issue. One of the things that dawned on me was she in fact did shatter the glass ceiling. It just wasn't in the way that we thought. We thought she would have to become president to do that. But everyone who was feeling good about her candidacy and loved her imagined her as commander-in-chief in the Oval Office. Everyone who hated her imagined her as commander-in-chief in the Oval Office. So she shattered it here. And that, I won't say that was better or worse or whatever, but it was different, but it did happen. And then 2 years later, we have tens of thousands of people who are calling in saying, I want to run. They're calling, I recall 40,000 people contacted Emily's list, the Democratic Women's PAC, I guess. And she did it. And then we have, the election, 2 years ago where women were like crazy successful. So will you say something more going back to was Sarah Palin, how important is it to have the right woman, the right kind of woman to you? Well, whether or not it's your book.
Right. Well, I think Sarah, I mean, what you want is a woman who is credible in the job, right? That's what you want. And what happened to Sarah Palin, look, the first couple of weeks of that campaign, I remember thinking and in fact writing that she was a female Ronald Reagan. That's how good she was as a performer, right? And she had her she had her ear to the ground on a particular piece of the Republican Party. She had great lines, she had great wit, she had terrific television demeanor, etc.
Mhm.
What did her in was that she couldn't ever rise to the level of being credible to do the job. And I think in the old, had she been a classic balancer, right, then nobody would have particularly cared because nobody would have expected her to do anything. But the combination of the change in the way we saw the vice presidency, because remember we'd had Cheney, who was really powerful, right? The combination of the change in the way we saw the vice presidency and just McCain's age. He was 72 and he had had cancer. So that meant that she got evaluated much more seriously. And I don't think that had much to do with her being a woman. I think if McCain or anybody had picked a man who maybe was a great political performer but just didn't know anything, and made dumb comments, he might not have added to the ticket either.
Hmm. Right. But as a feminist, did part of you, when you think about a man who didn't know anything and a woman who didn't know anything, would you have felt worse because she was representing women and she didn't know anything, or would you have felt better because she broke that ceiling?
I think I felt better because she broke that ceiling. I think that was good. I think I was happy to see that the Republican Party was willing to put a woman up there because, let's face it, there are lots of conservative women who are competent, very competent. I think where she failed was on the competence test. And
Hmm.
I think that was really unfortunate for her and frankly for all of us.
Right, right. Let me come over here. Oh, Eileen, gosh, it's good to see you or hear you or read you. It sounds like you're narrowing the prospective candidates down to two, Susan Rice and Senator Kamala Harris. Can you narrow it down further? Is it possible there is someone under consideration we don't know about, e.g., Michelle Obama? And who would be your pick, knowing what you know?
Um, let's take them in order, okay? Susan Rice obviously has great competence, and I would expect her to be Secretary of State in a Biden administration. That looks very likely.
Mhm.
But Susan Rice has never run for office. She's never done the very hard work that politicians do. Chris Gabrielli, if you're still on the phone, you certainly know what this business is like. You've got to suffer fools gladly. You've got to shake hands and kiss babies and listen to people, tell you their sob stories, etc. You've got to have a sense of political strategy and political logic, which is not something that you get when you're an expert in foreign affairs.
Mhm.
I think that she might be a risk. I think the reason Kamala Harris's name is continually at the top is that she simply checks all the boxes. She's a
Mhm.
great television performer. As a former prosecutor, you can see her taking it to Trump. And remember that one of the classic roles of the vice president in the campaign is to do all the negative stuff, right? Take down the other side. So you can see her doing that well. She tried to do it to Joe Biden and drew some blood, so she can clearly do that. And she's had enough experience in the Senate. She's on the Senate Intelligence Committee, et cetera, that I think she has, a working knowledge of the difficult side of the presidency, which is the foreign policy side. I don't think you will find any other names. I don't think you'll see Michelle Obama come up there. First of all, we have a sense of who's being vetted, and the vetting is extremely important. I see somebody's got um, a vetting question here, Sarah, right, about Geraldine Ferraro. I mean, you know, they just missed her husband's problems. They just missed her husband's legal problems, tax problems, fiduciary problems, etc. And it was a mammoth distraction. It was a big, big problem. And boy, oh boy, ever since they really do the vetting, and I suspect that since we haven't heard Michelle Obama, she has not even been vetted. Not that there'd
Wow.
something, not that there'd be some anything you could necessarily find, but I don't think she's been vetted. You just can't do that. I mean, you just can't in this day and age put out somebody who hasn't been vetted.
Well, so I'm in Denver. There's this huge hoo-ha, like 8,000 people. And there are t-shirts going around that say, you know, Michelle, you know, 2020, etc. And so someone asks her from the audience, will you run? And everyone starts clapping and clapping. And she says, no, under no circumstances, because, you know why? You're clapping and you're cheering right now, and I know what it'll be like when I'm on the
Right,
campaign.
exactly.
You can't fool me. You can't fool me. Which I thought, do you remember when, because I was there for this too, when he gets on stage and she gets on stage and they do the fist bump,
Mhm.
and then it became this huge, huge issue, like in terms of, oh, what's this inside code for, etc. So I'm going to pick on Mikiachevich. He says, given Biden's huge experience in foreign affairs and now race issues being so relevant, will it be possible more? It will be possibly more important that the next VP focus on healing the many divides Trump opened or deepened. And before you answer, Elaine, I'm sitting in the Senate, you know, trying to be confirmed, and Joe Biden is chairing the committee that's supposed to try to confirm me, and so he comes in really late, and I don't think Mickey knows this, and because Mickey is a refugee from Bosnia who lived through all hell breaking loose, and suddenly this was a religious war, which it wasn't, and suddenly it was an ethnic war, which it wasn't, and so everything had been like dividing and dividing. And Biden walks in and he says, I'm really sorry that I'm late. There were 4 ambassadors or potential. And he said, I was just with President Izetbegovic, and that's why I'm late. Now, President Izetbegovic was what shall I say, the scholarly head of the Bosniaks, the Muslim part of this, quote, ethnic divide. And so I want you to know, Mickey, that every time after I would see Senator Biden after that, he would be talking about Bosnia and how incredibly important Bosnia was. And so he was very much in thinking about divides. And where are you in terms of when you think of him? Is he a divider? Is he a healer? In what ways is he either one?
You mean Biden, Swanee?
What
Yeah.
did I say?
Yeah,
Did
no,
I
I
say
just want to make sure
healer?
that who
Okay, yeah,
who
right,
was talking about.
right.
Oh, look, there he has said that he wants to be a uniter. Okay,
Yeah,
he says it all the time, and I think that that is his natural state. I mean, he worked across the aisle. Look, he even got in trouble during the primaries saying that he'd worked with, you know, Southern segregationists. You know, it caused a
right.
whole hoo-ha. But you know, and I think what he was trying to say is, I can work with people who are very, very different than me. And look, anybody who's president after Trump is going to have to get on a plane and fly around the world and try to repair our image around the world, our relationship with our allies. Trump is just a bull in a china closet. He has just broken everything he ever touches, and so the next president, frankly, even if we were to have a Republican president, you know, even if Trump didn't run it, whoever the next president is going to have to do a lot of repair work, because Trump is so far out the of the mainstream of where America has been and wants to be.
Mhm. Right, right. Let me, Marion Hatcher. I came in late. I do that all the time, Marion. How important is race to the decision on the VP position? And I should tell you that Marion Hatcher is, you've met her at my house, I think, Elaine. She's really one of the great, um, uh, what you talk about healers, a survivor of the whole sex trafficking world. And her, her Black identity is very, very important to her, which is one of the reasons that she is such an eloquent survivor, since most of the buying is white men buying Black and brown women and girls. So when when you talk about race and the decision of the VP, would you tell us not just how important is it, but what are the pros and cons of how important it is? Or
Well,
assuming it's important.
it's critically important because, again, as with women, that is what the Democratic Party is today. It is the party of women, and it is the party primarily of African Americans, to a little bit lesser extent Latinos. Okay, but it's a sort of um, brown party, if you will, right? And that's what the party is today. So they deserve a big seat at the table. I expect you'll see not just a Black woman be VP. I suspect the cabinet will be more or less equally divided between men and women. I suspect that there will be a Black woman on the Supreme Court, when Biden gets his first choice, if he's lucky enough to, be there and get a first choice. So it's an incredibly important coalition. Let me just show you how important it is. In Michigan, in 2016, Hillary got 70,000 fewer votes out of Detroit, which is almost all Black, than Obama had gotten in 2012.
Mhm.
Donald Trump won the state by 10,000.
Wow.
Okay,
Yeah.
all we needed to do was up that African American vote just by a little bit. In Milwaukee, Hillary Clinton got 44,000 fewer African American votes than Obama had in 2012. Trump won the state by 22,000. Okay, that fought. See, everybody, all the analysts jumped to make this big deal about white men, white working class men voting for Trump. Um, the numbers tell a different story. The
Mhm.
numbers tell a story of a large African American fall off in the vote, and particularly in some key places. So we have to keep remembering Hillary won the popular vote by a substantial margin, but
Mhm.
she lost the electoral college vote by 170,000 votes. It's very, very small, very, very small number.
Right, right. Um, we are going to tie this up in about 5 minutes. And I didn't ask you in advance about this, but I would love it if you would take those 5 minutes and if you would talk some more about what you like the best about your book, or what the surprise of your book is in terms where you discovered something you didn't know, or what are some lessons in your book that you don't see playing out or do see playing out, or your grandson and he's doing so well with his piano, and I just want you, this is your time, right?
Well, listen, the thing I like most about the book, and that I'd like to do more of, is frankly the history. Okay, because there are some just amazing stories, really untold stories, of the relationship between presidents and vice presidents. And what's of course the most fun are the bad ones, right? That's the most interesting. That's the most fun. It's like Tolstoy, happy families are all alike, but it's the arguing families that we want to know about. Well, it's the same thing here. And there are just so many great stories. I didn't put them in this book, but if I do more on this topic, I'll tell more of them. I mean, there were really crazy presidencies, right? Where the presidency itself had within it all the contradictions of the party, and some of those contradictions were pretty big, pretty enormous. And so that I think is, I mean, I think some of you will get a kick out of just the history. Teddy Roosevelt was the other Roosevelt who had a particularly bad relationship with his vice president, and they called the pair the hot tamale and the Indiana icicle, because Teddy Roosevelt was exuberant and passionate and a reformer, etc. His vice president was a really, really, really cold and reserved senator from Indiana, who basically tried to undermine everything that Teddy Roosevelt tried to do in the United States Senate. So there you go. And this goes all the way back. I mean, it goes back to, you know, when Thomas Jefferson was John Adams's vice president, right? Thomas Jefferson did not see his role as helping John Adams. They were from two different political parties. The Constitution got amended shortly after that, so that couldn't happen again. So they'd have to be from the same party. But, you know, Thomas Jefferson spent his entire vice presidency running against the president he served. So it was just a wild and woolly world back then.
Right.
I think whenever we think we haven't made any progress, there are some areas where we've made some progress.
Well, I have to say that, Elaine, when I think about your role in the Democratic Party, and how many years have you been a member of the decision-making apparatus?
1997.
Uh,
1997, so 23 years, yeah.
Right. I am so encouraged when I think about our country and when I think about your role on the inside, because Lord, we need you, and you're as close to the Lord as I know. So I really, I love the idea that you're about to come into a setting in which you will be as influential as you've ever been, and more so, because you and I are getting to that point where we have these layers, these strata of experience. And as you know, we're getting wiser as we're getting older. We've talked about that before. And it means so much to me that you're here. I'm going to be not only getting your book, downloading it, I'm going to be sending out the same kind of announcement that I did to friends about today. And I want everyone else who is listening right now to this or watching this webinar to do the same. And so it's going to be Brookings Press, is that right?
Press, yeah, just go to brookingspress.edu or .org, whatever it is, and you'll see the book. It's like $1.99. It's not exactly a heavy lift.
Okay.
You can definitely read it on the beach.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Well, thanks everybody. Wait, hold on. Fred Duvall, you and I worked together on the campaign in '92. So I don't know if you knew Fred. Oh yeah, he went over and did protocol.
Of course I knew Fred. When I saw his name out of the corner of my eye, Fred, hello. It's great to have you on this.
That's right. And I'm not going to read your question, Fred. I just wanted to say hello. Okay. Bye. Bye, everyone. Take care.